You'll sometimes see this sewing technique on backpacks and in quilting. It's called a curved seam on a flat panel. I start by drawing a line where my curved seam will eventually be. I've made the chalk line a little more clear by going over it again. Now, I separate the two pattern pieces and prepare them for sewing. I'll then chalk some light lines along the seam allowance of each pattern piece, and that will show you approximately how much smaller the total panel will get. Here it is, the approximate size of our new completed panel. Next, I match these two bottom corners of the pattern pieces by turning the right sides of the fabric toward one another. I try to align them as close to corner as possible. And because it's a little bit easier, I'm going to flip the pattern pieces so I start sewing on a straight line rather than a curve. Now with the sewing machine, I align the two pattern pieces with the leftmost edge of my presser foot. This is approximately a 1 centimeter seam allowance. It's also important to note the method by which we'll sew this seam. As you can see, I'm rolling the top pattern piece along the edge of the bottom pattern piece. What I hope to do is always sew with the two edges on top of each other. I'll actually have to bend the patterns as I sew. I'll start with a slight back stitch and then align the two pattern pieces as I continue to sew. I essentially use the bottom pattern piece as a guide, and I move the top piece over to the edge of the bottom piece. I've sped this clip up a little bit, but sometimes you can see that I lift the presser foot in order to more closely align the two edges. I did a pretty good job at sewing, but as you'll notice, I must have pulled a little harder on one pattern piece than the other and stretched the fabric. I'll cut my work off the machine and inspect my seam. It looks pretty good. The stitching's relatively even and all the stitches hit. I'm going to clean up the work a little bit by cutting off that extra length of that one pattern piece I pulled too hard. And there it is, a completed curved seam on a flat panel. Now let's add a top stitch for the next step of this project. I'm going to clip along the edge, not quite all the way, to the stitch line. This is going to allow my work to bend and flex a little more easily as I fold it over. As you can see, I haven't cut all the way to the stitches. I've probably left about 1/8 of an inch. Next, I'll press my seam allowance down just slightly in order to flatten out the work a little bit before my next seam. I'm going to use my drawing tool again to remind myself approximately where I will sew. I'm going to go just inside of the maximum width of the seam allowance, so just about under 1 centimeter. Here I am at the sewing machine and I'm checking to see that the seam allowance is folding towards the right. That means I'm going to put the stitch line for the top stitch to the right of the seam I already have in the fabric. And as a convenient guide, I align the seam that's already in the fabric just to the right of the left edge of my presser foot. As I sew, I pull out on the fabric to flatten the seam so I get a nice tight top stitch. Next, I'll check the back of my work. I'll flip it over and clean up my thread tail, and then I'll see how close I got with that top stitch to the edge of the seam allowance. Not bad, within about 1/8 of an inch the whole way. And you can see that the work was pulled tight enough when top stitched because it doesn't bubble at the original seam. Next, I'm going to add an edge stitch. It's mainly decorative, but it can add strength if your sewing wasn't spot on. Thanks for watching. I hope this video helped you to sew a curved seam on a flat panel.